So, in our journey through the Bible for an entire year, we just made a turn this week, and I don't know if you noticed it. We made a turn because the first 5 books of the Bible are attributed to Moses, and they're the Torah. They're the original 5 books of the Old Testament. The Pentateuch is another word for that. And those books really begin to teach us about who God is. They offer us the promise of the covenant. They offer us much of the law code that the Old Testament and the Israelite people will wrestle with throughout the entirety of their existence. And in Joshua, we have a book that fits the first 5 books in some ways and is moving forward in some other ways. And if you remember nothing else, think of that for just a moment. That we have a book that looks back and a book that looks forward. And that's what we're going to deal with this morning as we deal with this book. I'm going to give you some pieces of information, and then we're going to jump into a piece of scripture on this particular text. And I hope and I pray that you find this meaningful as we gather and as we worship God and as we wrestle with what this book, this library, the Bible has to tell us. So a few things about Joshua. First, its authorship. In more traditional senses, a lot of people, just like the first 5 books, will attribute this book to Joshua. The first 5 were attributed to Moses, but again, Joshua being Joshua, Moses having died in Deuteronomy, they would assume that Joshua is the author of this. And if you take that as the assumption, you would assume that this book was written just before his death. You would assume that Joshua, as a military and as an assistant to Moses, would be trying to record the works that he had been commissioned to do, the works that he had been led to do on God's behalf. But we also have a lot of clues that tell us that this book was a work in progress for a long time. How many of you in the reading of this book this week noticed that there was a bunch of moments where it says, and this is still there to this very day? Anyone catch that in the reading? If you didn't, it's there all over the place. It says, these stones are still there. This altar, it's still there. And that's a clue. That's a verbal clue to all of us that at least at some narrative point in the sharing of this text, that somebody had to add that in to help with legitimacy for people who are wrestling with this book. There's a question of, can I still go see what Joshua did? And generations later, most likely, not just minutes later or years later, but generations later, people are still tweaking this book, still sharing the history, and they will say that these stones are still there, giving validity to the moment that they're seeing. And so in that sense, we see that this book probably had additions and tweaks and working moments on it for a long period of time afterward. So we could assume that from as early as 1390 BCE, or roughly there, all the way to like 600 BCE, we could see people writing and working and wrestling with this text. By the way, when I say BCE, I don't know if I ever told you guys, before Common Era, it's the way that, like, at least since I've been in college, that I was told to refer to the time period before Jesus, when we go backwards in dates. So we assume that that's kind of where the authorship and the dating of this book is. This book, just like the last 2 books, is for another new generation of Israelites. It's the 3rd generation of Israelites that has been raised up to enter into the promised land that this book is written for. This book is not the slave people of Egypt. It's not the generation in the wilderness, and it's not the next generation. It's written as a chronological history of the parents that entered into the promised land, that did the hard work of the promised land. It's written for their children. Think of it that way. It's written so that they might understand what happened and why it happened as they entered into the promised land. This book tells people how the promised land came to be conquered by the Israelite nation, because it was a place that had already been inhabited by the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Jebusites and everyone else with an "ite" at the end of their last name. By the way, if your last name ends in an "ite," I'm so sorry, you probably got conquered. But that's kind of the way it went in this particular piece of text. The theme of it is possession of the promised land. There's three sections to it if you look at it kind of chronologically. There's the conquest section, the fighting section, the war section, and that's the first 12 chapters or so. And then it's the allotments of land. It's a fascinating section from chapter 13 through 21 where all the different people are acquiring the different lands that Joseph and the people of God had conquered. The 12 tribes of Israel start getting everything dispersed to them, except for one. Did you catch that? The Levites in it did not get to inherit any land, and we'll deal with that at the end of the sermon. And then Joshua gets a farewell, just like Moses got a farewell. He gets one less chapter. I don't know if it's because he's younger, newer, whatever. He gets a 2-chapter farewell. So that's kind of the beginning of this text. To help us go this morning, we're going to read Joshua chapter 11, verse 23. Just as a reminder, it's at the end of the conquest period. So a lot of the war language has already happened in this book when we read this verse. But I think it's an important verse because it's also a turn in the book and it's a turn in the history of the Israelites. So it says this. So Joshua took the whole land exactly as the Lord had promised Moses. Joshua gave it as a legacy to Israel according to their tribal shares. Then the land had a rest from war. Friends, this is the word of God for the people of God, and we say, thanks be to God. Now, when you read this book this week, if you did read the book this week, one of the things that you might have noticed is that there is a really powerful theme in the beginning of this book, and that is war and violence. In fact, many people have reached out to me and said it's a very distracting book to read in the beginning because the numbers and the sheer kind of traumaticness of this is hard to overcome. Now, I was a history major in undergraduate studies, in ancient studies of history. So basically what that means is that I studied war constantly. When you read ancient studies, that's often what you're reading about. And the wars they had back then were brutal. We talk about war and we fathom it on a certain level, and we go back even to World War I and World War II, and there's some brutality there that we no longer quite remember. We talk about it in some vague concepts, but the trauma of it, we've distanced ourselves from. In fact, many times now we watch movies, and when it comes to actual wars, we avoid the scenes, and the scenes that happen that have real war situations are kind of glossed through, and you actually usually don't see people really get hurt. All the damage happens off camera, or you watch a movie, and if there is gratuitous violence in it, it seems to be almost overdone so that our minds just kind of blank out and say that this is not reality. But when we read this book, we got to understand that there are people who understood the consequences of real life, hand-to-hand combat style war, which was intentionally one of the more brutal forms of war. And so if you found yourself distracted by reading the beginning of this book, I want you to know we're not going to dwell on it this morning. I don't have someone like I did with Leviticus ready to toss me up like a stuffed lamb that I'm going to pretend like we're going to sacrifice or something crazy like that. I did think about writing a musical number for the start of this, but it was just starting off by going, mass genocide, and that's all the further I got. But this book has so much more than that. I don't want us to get stuck there because this book does something that a lot of the other Old Testament books do. If you remember when we preached on Exodus, one of the first statements I made while preaching on the book of Exodus is to understand Exodus, you had to understand Genesis, right? You had to understand what had already transpired, what had already happened. And this book is similar to that. This book is first a book that will look backwards and speak some truth to what had happened in the past. And then it's a book that's going to look forward and start changing the narrative of the Israelites. It's going to start changing the rules and the representations. It's a really powerful book in that regard. So let's first talk about the backwards part. We always like to look back. Many of us in our society and our history, we have nostalgia. How many of you are nostalgic, right? We all are at some level. For some people, they're stuck in their high school football days. How many of you know somebody that still wears their high school football t-shirt, right? If they do, man, that thing's got to stink by now, right? You still have it, you still glorify it, and we talk about that as kind of the good old days, right? It's the song American Pie. right? You start singing it and you start thinking kind of glassy-eyed backwards a little bit. This book starts with a look back. And in the look back, what it does is it talks about the covenant between God and God's people. And it's defending that covenant. And it's also showing the magnitude to which God would defend his covenant. You see, the covenant that God made early on with who would become the Israelite people, when God made that covenant, when he made that promise to Abram to become Abraham, when he made that promise to us that still live in it today, what he said is, I'm going to make you a great people, a nation. And I'm going to make you as abundant as the stars in the sky or the sand on the shore. And when he made that covenant, the people of God quickly forgot that covenant as they were in slavery in Egypt. I don't know about you, but it's hard to imagine being a great people under slavery. It's hard to imagine being great when you feel oppressed, when you feel that everything you do is being resisted. Now, the Israelites, even against Pharaoh's most harsh punishments and trajectories, became abundant, so abundant that that's what brought them into slavery. But the beginning of this book, the beginning of Joshua, as they enter into the promised land, they need to remember and have courage that God's covenant will keep them safe when they're directly in harm's way. And so what we learn is the promised land is a good land. And if there's a good land, people want good land. And people already have inhabited the good land. People are already growing livestock in the good land. People are already having vineyards in the good land. And as they go to possess this land, the people don't just go, oh, we've been waiting for you. Can you have it now? They want to defend their good land. And so what happens is wars pursue, battles against city-states and micro-kings. And Joseph has to lead the people in courageous battle against encampments and settlements. When you read the book of Joshua, you get the kids' song, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. How many of you ever sang that growing up, right? How many of you ever said, did it say fought or fit, right? How many of you wrestled with that moment? And then when you read the story itself and you go through it, you realize that there's miraculous things happening in this particular battle. This is a siege on a fortified city where it has walls to defend itself, and it would have food and water inside it to sustain the people. Sometimes in these siege situations, the cities would be ready for such siege back in that day so that they could be fortified for 6, 12, 18 months, 2 years even in some situations. They could withstand and hold all the people of that country within their walls and basically starve out the invaders. And so when Joshua shows up, this is a major undertaking that they're about to have. And what they learn in this moment is that they're supposed to go around the city, and they're supposed to be led by the priests, and they're supposed to have blasts on trumpets, and people at some point are supposed to shout and yell and scream. Now, this is great for Sunday school activities, right? How many of you know that little kids love to shout and scream and blow on little horns, right? This is like the perfect little thing for them. Have them march around the gym on the outside, stop and scream and yell and burn up some energy. That's what we're supposed to do with this story, right? No. We might teach it that way. But what we're supposed to do is learn to trust in the provision that God has. In all these war situations, what God says is, go to these situations, have courage and bravery, and bring me with you. And then do as I tell you, and I will give you victory. In each one of those, he says, do as I tell you, and I will give you victory. And so in the looking back part, what we're learning is that the covenant of God has certain rules and trajectories in it. And in the covenant of God, what God says is, when you do what I've asked you to do, I will give you victory even against the most insurmountable odds. In the looking backward part, what we're learning is that God tells us that miracles can happen, that profoundly amazing things can happen if we simply listen to God and do as God would instruct us to do, and to be patient with him and to take courageous leaps forward with him. None of these things were safe bets. None of them were things that should have been done with somebody with their right mind, but instead the people trusted in God. They went and they marched around cities, and they blew trumpets and they screamed, and walls came tumbling down, and they were able to conquer and survive. In the pointing backwards part, what we're reminded is that God made a promise to make a great nation, and God is going to keep it. But we as a people also made a promise that God would be our God and no other. And no other. What we learn is that when people go into a place where people already inhabit the land, where people already exist, is that temptation arises and that we start desiring things that we shouldn't have. And we start being tempted by false gods, many of which are just earthly possessions. And in those spaces, consequences will ensue. When we read this particular book and we're looking backwards, we look to that battle of Jericho and we look to the example of Rahab, which we'll get to in a minute. But we need to deal with the one loss that they had in Joshua. How many of you noticed that there was one loss in battle? It was the city of Ai. And in the city of Ai, what they learned is that one of the heads of families, Achan, who was a good military person, who before this moment was somebody who was respectable and fine. Achan had in the previous battle had coveted some robes and some silver or gold and some other items, and he thought that those were fine things, and instead of seeing those things destroyed and spoiled, he decided to possess just a couple of things and to put them under his cloak in his tent. How many of you have ever wanted to not see something go to waste that wasn't yours? I remember growing up, my dad's got a hobby farm just south of Iowa City. And I remember one of the neighbors had this old car in the woods. I finally figured out that it was a 1922 Ford Model T. I figured that out by research, not by asking. The research was me running through this guy's woods that weren't my woods and trying to figure out whether I could pull this old rusted hulk of a car out. I had visions of a hot rod in my young brain. How many of you think some 18-year-old kid needs a tea bucket, right? I do, right? But it wasn't mine. And all I did was get into deeper and deeper messes every time I went over there and started trying to get into it. But yet, in my young brain, I thought it was causing no one harm because this poor farmer had left it out there for generations at least. It had rusted out there for who knows how long. I thought nobody would notice. In fact, I'd probably be doing the guy a favor whenever he decided to clear that land. I didn't realize that there was a family connection, that it had some backstories to it that I wasn't to know. Didn't know that it would offend them if I tried to do it. Have you ever done something like that? And the consequences on that aren't just your own, but your family's. This is the same thing that happens to Achan in this story. Achan sees something and he thinks, this is no big deal. This is something that isn't going to harm anybody. This is just a sweet and innocent little thing that I'm going to do, that even though it's against the rules, it doesn't harm anyone, so it must not really be that bad against the rules, and so I can get away with it. And what happens is that the people of God experience their only loss at the Battle of Ai because he couldn't listen to the rules, and then the consequence of him not listening to the rules are brutal and severe, just like this entire book is. He's stoned to death with his family. The pile of rubble is still there to this day, according to the book. The consequences of his action are severe, not just on him, but on everyone else that he has had direct influence over and under. And even beyond that, the entirety of the Israelite people, the consequence is a loss in battle. And I don't know about you, but when you think about ancient battles and you think about losses, it's not that you came home and licked your wounds, you came home and you buried your dead. In this particular moment, looking back, what it reminds us is that the moments in which we choose to stray from that covenant that God had given us, the consequences can be severe. And even if we think that it is not harming somebody, it is not for us to fully know. So we need to wrestle with what we're doing. We need to take it seriously in that relationship. Achan didn't, and the consequences were severe. The other direction in this book is the forward direction. It's easy to see us looking backwards to the laws and the covenant and the promise. But this book also does make a subtle shift forward where the rules do change in some little ways. If you remember from the Levitical Code and from Deuteronomy, one of the rules was that you weren't to intermarry, you weren't to bring foreigners into your family and into your life. And yet we have this amazing story in the book of Joshua about Rahab. Anyone remember her? She saves a couple of people who end up helping them take the city of Jericho. She is somebody who is a foreigner and an outsider. And she, by her ability to show the Israelites grace and courage, she is eventually somebody who becomes assimilated in to the Israelite nation. In fact, when we read about the lineage of Jesus within the Gospels, we hear that she is in the line that leads to David and David leading to Jesus. A foreigner brought into the Israelite nation in the beginning of their possession of the promised land, becomes somebody with a marked and prominent history that teaches the Israelites something about how they too could live. This is strange. This is forward-looking from the text that we had before us. This is a turn that God had. Again, the warning earlier was not to intermarry. The warning earlier was not to allow your sons or daughters to be in these relationships. But here, because God chooses to save God's people in unique and different ways, we see a changing and a shifting in the rules. Really what was happening was God was building up the Israelite people to allow them to understand and define themselves, to become self-aware in so many ways, like many of us need to. And then having become self-aware of who they were as a people, then they had the provision to be able to look out to new people and to bring them in. But in the beginning of this, in the beginning of Joshua, the people that they chose to bring in were those who would be willing to follow after God. The people that they brought in would be those who they could trust to help them not only in military battle and success, but in the following of God's rules and God's ways. Rahab became a courageous person who could see and understand the change that was happening before her, who would be willing to defy an old way that would lead to death. And even as a foreigner, she would be somebody who would find the acceptance of God. And by the way, if you didn't notice, I've said the word she a lot. When all of our heroes were men, here's a woman standing out in courage. This Old Testament text and this particular moment is a profound shift in so many ways, because not only is the foreigner brought in, but it's a female foreigner. When men were supposed to be the only ones with courage, bravery, strength, and honor, here she has all those attributes. She becomes somebody who we can honor. It's the beginning of a transition, and it isn't complete within her life or within her death or even for many, many generations later. But it is the beginning of God preparing God's people to keep transitioning forward. This book is an amazing text because not only does it point backwards and give us a space to find honor and trust and hope in God's covenant, but it also says that in the appropriate times, God will continue to modify and change and kind of work and massage the relationship that we have, so that in our possession of this promised land, in our possession of the places where God will lead us, we too will change as the land has changed, as God's relationship with us has changed. And what it does is it opens the circle wider. What it does is it begins to lead us to what we as Christians in this day begin to understand as evangelism. It starts in the context of the day in which it was. But really, what happens is a heart was able to be opened to who God was and who God is, and she was able to experience that change and forevermore influence the Israelite history and your and I history. Rahab was somebody who the people were able to share the good news with. For those of us who hear this, what we might need to hear is that somebody whom we might think as our enemy may be able to be our ally if we but had the courage of a conversation, of genuine relationship with her. I think the reason she was able to change and her heart was be warmed was by the provision of God, but also because the relationship was right there. How many of us have experienced where our enemies, that we supposed to be enemies, became our friends when we actually sat down and talked with them? Rahab is a forward progression. This book is a product of its history and its day, but it's also a book that continues to show us that we will change into tomorrow. Lastly, I'm going to touch on one quick thing. It won't take but a moment. But I want to point out the possession of land, because it takes up a good chunk of the book, and I haven't really touched it in the sermon. In the distribution of the land, what's going on in that moment is that all the tribes are getting different pieces. And what happens is two things. One, a promise is being fulfilled, that the people would be able to be an abundant people. And to be an abundant people, they have to change from this homogenous small group that was in the wilderness, who was always clustered together, to a bigger, broader group. So they'd have to go out. That's a good thing. On the bad end of it, though, is they begin to define themselves as distinct and other against one another. Have you ever had siblings fight? I grew up with 5 siblings, all within 3 years of age of each other. You want to talk about an amazing fight once in a while? We could do that. And oftentimes it was when we defined ourselves as against one another instead as part of our family that we were. That's really what happens to the tribes. They begin to define themselves by their tribal unit more than as Israelites. And that's when the things of breaking down in the future are going to happen. That's when the separation and the anxiety happen. And then one of the groups that's most prominent and defined in is the Levites. The Levites are told that they're not to get land of their own. They're not supposed to get a space that's their own. They're supposed to instead trust that the home and the livestock that they get, not the entire area, but the home and the livestock that they get among the other tribes, and then God, and God alone, would be enough. Now, it's an amazing thing to say that for some people, God's not enough. But I would argue that in the moment that we're reading this particular book, what we learn is that it's often the priests, the Levites, who would become the different leaders that even Jesus would be scrapping with, that oftentimes are the ones that lead the people astray, who don't follow God's rules and ordinances, who become priests of other religions and other gods. Why is that? I think we see the root of it here. And the root of it is in the distance and the separation. Yes, having people who are clergy and set apart is important. I think God was wise in that, especially speaking as a pastor. As a pastor myself, I understand that after prayer and discernment and wrestling and other people affirming or challenging my call, that it led to this moment. And as a pastor, I want to tell you, one of my deepest calls as a pastor, one of my strongest ones, is to help grow other pastors, those who haven't yet experienced the call. It's my deepest passion that that's what I'm most remembered for. But I also want to say that we have to be careful with our pastors and our clergy. Far too often the news will tell of stories of those who became corrupted by their positions and their power. And what I think happened is in the beginning of this narrative, you see that the Levites were set apart. They were set apart, and that was good. But what happened in their set apartness is that I think their relationship with their siblings broke down. In some places, when they were set apart, they would be treated as if they were beggars in a foreign land because they were in the possession of their siblings' land. And in other places, because they were set apart for God, they felt entitled to the best of things. I think we have to pay attention to our relationships, not just to our clergy, but to everybody. Because when we start elevating and diminishing people, we start flirting with the idolatry of it. God, in the Old Testament specifically, but even in the New Testament, warned us consistently that having another God besides God would lead to treacherous roads. And sometimes our gods can be ourselves, and sometimes it can be our heroes. Sometimes it could be our sports fans, our politicians. Sometimes it can be our teachers. Sometimes it can be our parents. We need to give honor to people, respect to people, but we need to be careful on how the relationship plays out. Because I think in Joshua we see the beginning of some toxicity of the relationship that we're still dealing with today. And we need to be careful about it. We need to make sure that we don't subject our brothers and sisters, that our siblings are cared for as equals, partners, peers among the family of God. Because when the Israelite nation was at its best, when it conquered all the tribes and all the other lands, is when they saw themselves as family, when they kept God at the front, and when they could lead as Joseph did. Let us pray. Gracious God, I give you thanks and praise on this day for all the ways in which you reach out to us, transform us, and shape us. Continue to knead our hearts and our lives. And so, God, continue to do that work, to redeem your people, now and forever. Amen.